Welcome to the channel Shadows in the Night. Before the story begins, let me remind you that everything you are about to hear is entirely fictional. Created solely for storytelling, entertainment, and psychological suspense, any resemblance to real places, people, or events is purely coincidental. And now, dim the lights. Lower your voice, because this is a story best heard in the dark. My name is Nguyen Van Hai. 35 years old, I used to work an office job in Saigon, living among the smell of cold coffee, freezing air conditioners, and emails that arrived well past midnight. I didn't leave the city because I dreamed of nature. I left because I could no longer bear waking up every morning with a heart that felt like stone. A head buzzing with debt, expenses, and endless sleepless nights. I needed to run. And Ma Da appeared in my mind like a whispered name, as if someone were deliberately reminding me of it. My old, rattling motorbike carried me out of Saigon while the morning was still wrapped in mist. The deeper I went toward Vinh Cu, the worse the road became. Red dirt clung to the tires. On both sides stood towering trees, thick and dense, their canopies blocking out the sky. The air began to change. The smell of cooking smoke, rotting leaves, and damp mold seeped into every breath. The last gas station I passed was more than an hour behind me. From that point on, there were no houses, no human voices, only the constant hum of insects, like someone whispering right next to my ear. The Ma Da Forest Ranger Station appeared suddenly at the edge of the woods. Small and worn down, the corrugated metal roof was rusted and blotchy, the wooden walls darkened by time. A wind from Tryon Lake carried cold moisture and a faint fishy odor, like mud that hadn't been stirred in years. I hadn't even set down the kickstand when the station door opened. An elderly man stepped out, thin, slightly hunched, his faded ranger uniform clinging to his frame. "You're high, right?" His voice was low and raspy, like someone more accustomed to speaking with the forest wind than with people. I nodded. Before I could say hello, he turned and walked back inside. "Come in, there's something you need to read first." Inside, the station was darker than I expected. The fluorescent light flickered, revealing damp stains spreading across the walls. He placed an old sheet of paper in front of me, its edges curled, the typed letters blurred with age. At the top was a short title, Safety Rules. I laughed, a hint of mockery rising in my chest. "This place even has rules." "Huh?" He looked up, his eyes suddenly turned cold, like Tryon Lake on a windless day. "Read it first, then laugh." I read. With every line, the smile on my face slowly disappeared. Do not run toward the sound of a crying child. Do not look into the eyes of an animal with an abnormal shape. Do not search for the source of unfamiliar flute music. Do not speak to anyone who looks human but moves unnaturally. Do not stare at a lone shadow for too long. Do not trust cries for help at night. 6 rules. Short, cold. I looked up and forced a smile to lighten the mood. Scary stories to mess with newcomers, right? He stayed silent for a few seconds, then stood up and opened a filing cabinet behind him. Yellow documents and a few black and white photos lay neatly inside. He slid one photo toward me. A young man stood in front of this very station, smiling brightly. His name was Min. He heard a child crying. He slid another photo forward. A woman, her eyes exhausted. Her name was Lan. She looked straight into a monitor lizard's eyes. His voice was flat, emotionless, but each word fell like a heavy stone. I swallowed hard. In that damp, cramped space, I suddenly realized the fishy smell didn't come only from the lake. 11 people in 15 years. He said, no bodies were ever found. That night, I shared a room with a young guy named Tuan. Fresh out of school, sun-tanned skin, eyes always bright, carrying the enthusiasm I had lost long ago. When he heard about the rules, he burst out laughing. "Uncle Tu's been here too long. Making things up. It's just a forest, man. Outside, the wind grew stronger. The treetops rubbed against each other, making a screeching sound like fingernails dragging across wood. Night fell quickly in Ma Da. Around 11, just as I drifted off, a sound froze my blood. A child crying. Not wailing, but soft sobbing. Mixed within it was a gentle humming, slow and drawn out, as if echoing from deep within the forest. My heart pounded. Goosebumps covered my skin. Each note of the lullaby wrapped around my ears, pulling at my instincts. But in my mind, the first line on that old sheet of paper flashed vividly. Tuan sat up, his eyes wide with fear but filled with determination. "Do you hear that? There's a kid out there." I grabbed his hand. My palm was soaked with sweat. "Listen carefully, that sound, it's too steady." Tuan yanked his hand free. His voice trembled, but his back was stiff as he picked up the flashlight. "What if it's real? I can't just leave them." The door opened. Cold wind rushed in, carrying an even stronger stench of damp decay. Tuan's flashlight beam wavered among the blackened tree trunks. The crying led him farther and farther away. Then, suddenly, everything went silent. A scream tore through the night, twisted, stretched, as if it were being strangled halfway through. The flashlight beam shook violently a few times, then went out completely. I stood frozen in the doorway. Somewhere in that forest, something had just learned how to imitate human sounds very well. And I had the terrible feeling that it knew. I was here. Behind me, from deep within the darkness of the room, I thought I heard a very soft breath. And it wasn't mine. After the night Tuan disappeared, the ranger station fell into a very strange kind of silence. Not the calm, peaceful quiet of a deep forest, but the feeling that something was deliberately holding its breath, waiting for me to make a single wrong move. The next morning, thick fog covered everything, bleaching the narrow trail into the forest until it vanished. The damp smell clung to my skin. The clothes I put on felt icy, as if they had just been pulled from the bottom of a stream. Uncle Tu and 2 other rangers went with me to search for Tuan. No one spoke. The only sound was our boots crushing dry leaves. Over and over again, steady and unsettling. Tuan's footprints were clearly visible for the first 30 steps or so. Then they stopped abruptly, as if he had dissolved into thin air. There were no signs of a struggle. No drag marks, no blood, only soft, damp forest soil and twisted tree roots rising from the ground like exposed veins. One of the rangers crouched down, his voice dropping, just like the previous cases. I didn't ask what it was like. I already knew the answer, even though I didn't want to admit it. Uncle Tu stood there for a long time, staring at the empty space where the footprints ended, as if looking into a bottomless mouth. "Last night, did you hear anything else?" I shook my head, my throat dry. I didn't dare mention the sound of breathing right behind me. Some things, once spoken aloud, feel like an invitation for them to step closer. From that day on, I truly lived as if I were merely borrowing space in the forest. I kept the list of rules with me at all times, folded neatly in my chest pocket. Whenever my heart started racing, I took it out and read it like a protective charm. During the day, Ma Da Forest looked strangely gentle. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, scattering across the ground. Birds sang. The wind over Tryon Lake sounded normal, real, alive. But every time the sun began to sink behind the tall trees, everything changed. The air grew heavier. Sounds became distant, as if echoing through a thick layer of water. That afternoon, I went to inspect the western part of the forest, an area few people visited. As I walked, I heard a faint rustling in the bushes. I stopped. A monitor lizard crawled out, much larger than usual. Its skin was dull gray and rough. And when it turned its body, my heart dropped into my stomach. 3 tails. They swayed lightly over the wet ground, leaving long, twisting marks. Its eyes gleamed, reflecting something that didn't feel like the gaze of an animal. I remembered the second rule. Do not look into its eyes. I slowly stepped backward, feeling cold sweat run down my spine. The lizard remained still, its head slightly tilted, as if studying my reaction. Only when I fully turned my back and walked quickly toward the trail did I hear it move away. Heavy and unhurried. As if it wasn't in any rush at all. As if it knew I wouldn't go far. Night fell. The wind from the lake grew stronger, carrying the repeated sound of water slapping against the shore. I was sitting inside the station when I heard something strange. Flute music. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. The melody was sad, drawn out, very much like the sound of kite flutes from my childhood. An image flashed in my mind, paper kites drifting under a gray sky. A deep, genuine longing for home and childhood welled up inside me. I almost stood up and went outside before I suddenly froze. The third rule. I closed my eyes, tried to remember the tune, then whistled it very softly, matching each note. The flute outside stopped for a few seconds. My heart pounded. Then, from far away, another whistle answered back, slow and deliberate. For reasons I couldn't explain, I felt as if the path behind the station had grown slightly brighter, while the trail leading deeper into the forest had turned pitch black. As if being swallowed, I didn't dare try again. Over the next few days, the forest began to feel more crowded. Not with people, but with presence. Once, in the blazing midday sun, I saw a man wearing an old traditional shirt standing by the stream. His skin was ashen, his face expressionless. He glided over the ground, his feet never touching the dry leaves. I turned and ran, my heart pounding wildly, ears ringing. There was no sound of pursuit behind me, but I knew that if I had hesitated for even a second longer, I might never have made it back to the station. On the seventh night after Tuan vanished, I heard a cry for help. A woman's voice, very clear, not mechanically repeated. There were sobs, ragged breathing, a raw, convincing fear. I sat perfectly still, my hand gripping the list of rules. Outside, the wind whistled through the cracks in the door, carrying that familiar fishy smell. Please help me? The voice came again, weaker, broken. I swallowed hard. In that moment, I understood something terrifying. Not every cry for help is fake. But if you choose wrong, the forest will not give you a second chance. I stood up, my heart hammering, and slowly cracked open the station door. Outside, the darkness was thick, like a curtain waiting to be pulled aside. And I had the feeling that from many different directions within the forest, something was listening to every breath I took, waiting to see whether I would choose right or wrong. I stood at the station door for a long time, my hand resting on the latch, unable to open it all the way. The cries for help from the forest continued, sometimes close, sometimes distant, blending with the wind moving through the treetops into a chilling sound. Like someone quietly sighing, the familiar fishy stench drifted by again, stronger than before, like mud mixed with old blood. I closed my eyes and forced myself to listen carefully. The voice was uneven. It paused. It carried emotion. It didn't sound like the mechanical repetition Uncle Tu had warned me about. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside. Each step felt like I was walking on my own fear. The beam swept across towering tree trunks, their shadows stretching and twisting across the ground, overlapping like a maze. The voice led me along the small stream behind the station. Water trickled softly, icy cold, and then I saw her. A woman was tied to a tree. Her hair was tangled, her clothes caked with mud. Her face was pale, lips cracked, her eyes filled with panic and fading hope. When the flashlight hit her, she broke down sobbing, her entire body shaking. Please, I'm here, help me. I rushed forward and untied the ropes, my hands trembling so badly it took several tries to loosen the knots. When she was free, she nearly collapsed, and I had to catch her. Her body was ice cold, frighteningly light, as if she had been exhausted for a very long time. We returned to the station in silence, broken only by labored breathing and hurried footsteps on wet ground. Once inside, under the dim yellow light, she slowly began to calm down. I handed her a cup of water and noticed her hands wouldn't stop shaking, her fingernails packed with dried dirt. "My name is Lan," she said weakly, avoiding my eyes. "My husband, he heard a voice in the forest, and he dragged me with him." Her story came out in fragments, sometimes fast, sometimes slow. At first, her husband had heard a lullaby, sounding exactly like his mother's voice from years ago. Then came someone calling his name, so familiar it felt impossible to doubt. He began to change. His eyes grew strange. He muttered to himself. That night, he tied her to the tree, saying he needed to leave bait here so it would feel safe. Then walked deep into the forest alone. Since then, she had heard cries for help everywhere, overlapping, real and fake tangled together until she could no longer tell which were human and which were something else. By the time she finished, my spine felt frozen solid. The rules weren't meant to abandon people in danger. They were meant to test who could remain clear-headed at that razor-thin boundary. When I turned back to the table to set the cup down, I suddenly froze. On the tabletop, right next to my list of rules, there was a thin trail of water, like the mark of a wet hand just placed there. I looked around. The station door was still closed. There was only me and Lan. "Did you touch the table?" I asked. She shook her head violently, terror flooding her eyes. "No, since I came in. I've been sitting right there." A soft sound came from behind the station, like footsteps sliding over wet soil. Then another, not heavy, not rushed, steady, patient. Lan suddenly grabbed my hand, her nails digging into my skin. It followed me back. The light flickered. The air inside the room turned sharply cold, moisture gathering into a thin mist. Through the crack in the door, I saw a shadow standing still in the open ground. It wasn't attached to any object. The shadow trembled, warped, as if struggling to stand upright. I remembered the fifth rule: do not stare for more than 3 seconds. I turned away immediately, pulling Lan back into the corner. My heart pounded so hard it felt like someone was knocking from inside my chest. Outside, the footsteps stopped. Silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. Then, a lullaby began to play. This time it was very close, right against the station wall. The voice was soft and sweet, like a mother's arms from long ago. Lan started sobbing, clamping her hands over her ears. I'm not listening. I wanted to cover my ears too. But I knew that if I let emotion guide me, I would end up like Tuan. I pulled out the list of rules and read each line, each word, clinging to them like a final lifeline. Outside, the lullaby shifted rhythm, slower, deeper, as if it were listening to me read. A gentle knock sounded on the door. Very light, very polite. "Open the door, it's cold." The voice wasn't a child's. It wasn't a woman's. It wasn't a man's. It sounded like many voices stitched together into one. Lan screamed and buried her face in my chest. I clenched my teeth and stayed silent. After minutes that felt like hours, the knocking stopped. The lullaby faded back into the forest. The air slowly warmed again. I collapsed into a chair, my back soaked with sweat. The next morning, I escorted Lan out of the forest and handed her over to the local authorities. When I returned to the station, Uncle Tu looked at me for a long moment, then silently nodded. No questions, no praise, no blame, as if he had been living with moments like this for a very long time. That night, I stayed alone. The ranger station sank into darkness, filled only with the sound of insects. I placed the list of rules neatly on the table. Outside, Ma Da Forest continued to breathe, to live, to wait. And in the moment before I drifted into sleep, I realized something. Since saving Lan, I hadn't heard a child crying anymore. Instead, far away, Deep within the forest, there was a familiar whisper. It sounded exactly like Tuan's voice, calling my name slowly, patiently, as if it knew I would have to pay for breaking the rules. After the night I heard Tuan's voice echoing from deep within the forest, I couldn't sleep, not the restless kind caused by fear, but the sensation of being watched all night long. My eyelids felt unbearably heavy, yet every time I closed them, I saw a flashlight beam shaking between the trees, then suddenly cutting out. The damp, moldy smell clung to my nose, even though the station doors were tightly shut. It wasn't until near dawn, when fog turned the trail completely white, that I finally drifted into a brief, shallow sleep. When I woke up, the first thing I did was check the list of rules. The 6 lines were still there, old and faded, the ink worn thin by time, but something made my blood run cold. Along the bottom edge of the paper was a thin smear of mud, stretched out like a fingertip dragged across it. I was certain I had placed the paper neatly on the table the night before. Completely dry, I wiped the mud away, but a slick, clammy feeling lingered on my fingertips, cold to the bone. During the day, I patrolled the outer perimeter of the station, keeping myself busy so my thoughts wouldn't wander. Ma Forest looked suspiciously gentle. Sunlight poured through lush green canopies, birds calling brightly overhead. If I hadn't witnessed everything myself, I might have scoffed at those rules, just like Tuan once did. But I knew the truth. The forest was only lightly asleep, and when it woke up, it would remember very clearly who had gone against its will. That afternoon, Uncle Tu stopped by the station. He brought some dried supplies with him, his eyes more tired than usual. We sat across from each other in the smoke-scented room. "You heard it, didn't you?" he asked quietly, avoiding my gaze. I didn't ask what he meant. I nodded, my throat painfully dry. It called me, using Tuan's voice. Uncle Tu let out a long sigh, his back seeming to curve a little more. Ma Forest doesn't like being owed. My brow tightened, my heartbeat slowing, heavy. Owed, what? He was silent for a long time, then stood up and opened the old filing cabinet. This time, he didn't show me any photographs. Instead, he took out a worn leather notebook. The pages inside were yellowed, filled with messy handwritten notes. Back then, Zone D was crowded. Bombs, hunger, people running. Many died without burial. Children lost their mothers. Mothers lost their children. Grievance built up and clung to this forest. At first, it was just strange noises. Then, it learned how to call people. He stopped and looked straight at me, his eyes heavy. Every time someone breaks the rules and survives, the forest remembers. And it collects. A cold draft slipped through the cracks in the door, carrying a faint fishy smell. I clenched my hands. How does it collect? Uncle Tu didn't answer right away. He simply shook his head slightly. It's not time for you to know everything yet. That night, I stayed alone. I turned off most of the lights, leaving only a dim glow to illuminate the room. Outside, insects sheared endlessly, steady like the forest's heartbeat. I tried not to think about Tuan's voice, but the more I avoided it, the clearer it became, every word, every tone, painfully familiar. Near midnight, I heard very light footsteps circling the station. Not hurried, not sneaky, like someone on patrol, completely familiar with the path. I held my breath and pressed my ear against the wooden wall. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. A pause followed, long enough for me to hear my own heart pounding. "Hi, open the door and let me in." Tuan's voice, clear, close, even carrying that familiar soft chuckle at the end, just like when he used to tease me while he was alive. My spine went ice cold. I bit my lip and stayed silent. Outside, a sigh followed, disturbingly human. "I'm so cold, I'm exhausted." My hands trembled as I pulled out the list of rules, my eyes locking onto the final line. Do not trust any cries for help after dark, especially repeated calls. I listened carefully. The voice outside began to change rhythm. The sentences became identical, repeating over and over, unnaturally even. "Hi, open the door and let me in." The door shuddered slightly, as if someone were resting their forehead against it, breathing out icy air. The damp stench intensified, seeping through the cracks. I covered my ears, shut my eyes tight, and whispered the rules over and over like a chant. The voice gradually faded, stretching thin, until it dissolved back into the forest. Only when everything went silent did I dare open my eyes. On the ground in front of the station, a clear line of wet footprints led from the forest, and stopped right at the threshold. The toes pointed inward, as if their owner were still standing there, just no longer visible. I understood something truly terrifying. The forest doesn't just imitate the voices of strangers. It keeps the voices of those who belong to it. And from that night on, I knew Tuan had never left Ma Da. He was simply learning how to come back. Outside, the wind from Tryon Lake grew stronger, carrying a very faint, very familiar sound. A whistle. Not meant to guide anyone. After the night I heard the whistling echo from deep within the forest. I knew there was no turning back, not because I had become braver, but because Ma Da Forest had stopped pretending. It no longer called to me with unfamiliar sounds. It used my memories. It used Tuan's voice. It used the very things I could never let go of. The next morning, Uncle Tu didn't return to the station. I waited until noon, then into the afternoon, but the dirt path remained empty. Wind moved through the trees, producing long, murmuring sounds, like quiet whispers of conversation. I decided to go look for him, not because I believed I could save anyone, but because I needed to know what the forest wanted from me. The path leading toward the old Zone D area was carpeted with dry leaves. The air there felt heavier. The damp, moldy scent mixed with an old, fishy odor, like meat forgotten for too long. The deeper I went, the dimmer the light became. Even though the sun was still high, I heard footsteps behind me, very soft, but when I turned around, there were only trees standing motionless. I didn't run. I understood that running would only make things happen faster. Near a dry stream, I found Uncle Tu. He was sitting with his back against a large tree, eyes wide open but unfocused. His face was strangely peaceful, like someone who had been waiting for this moment for a long time. On the ground in front of him lay the old leather notebook. I crouched down, my trembling hand touching his wrist. Ice cold. "You've arrived?" The voice came from behind me. Not Uncle Tu's voice. It was my own. Low, steady, frighteningly real. I spun around. A man stood a few steps away, identical to me in every detail. His face was expressionless. His eyes were deep black, reflecting no light at all. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice hoarse, my throat tightening. The man tilted his head, the corner of his mouth lifting into a slow, familiar smile. "I'm the part that stays." The wind suddenly rose, strong and cold. The treetops shook violently, dry leaves spiraling around my feet. In that instant, I understood. The forest doesn't just keep people. It keeps roles. Being a ranger isn't a job. It's a replacement. Tuan, was it the same for him? I whispered, my heart racing. The figure in front of me didn't answer right away. From behind the trees, Tuan's voice echoed, very close, very clear, mixed with that familiar quiet laugh. "We just stayed behind to get used to it first. Now it's your turn." I stepped back, my foot hitting Uncle Tu's notebook. The last page fell open, the handwriting shaky and uneven. "The forest needs someone who understands the rules. But the more you understand them, the less you can leave." I laughed, a dry, broken laugh that shattered in my throat. Everything I had done up to this point wasn't to escape, it was to prove I was suitable. I could tell real from fake. I knew when to listen, when to stay silent, when to turn back. And because of that, the forest chose me. And if I refuse? I asked quietly. The figure stepped closer. His feet never touched the ground. No sound followed. The familiar damp stench enveloped me. Then you'll end up like the others. But the forest will have to teach everything again from the beginning. I closed my eyes. In that moment, I thought of Saigon, of sleepless nights, of the emptiness every morning brought. At least here, everything had rules, order, a reason to exist. When I opened my eyes, the forest was quiet again. No figure, no voices, only Uncle Tu sitting there, unmoving, and the notebook resting neatly in my hands. That night, the ranger station lights came back on. I sat at the desk and carefully typed out the core safety rules of Ma Da Forest. 6 rules, no more, no less. At the bottom of the page, I added one small line, barely noticeable. Anyone who reads and fully understands these rules may never leave the forest. Outside, the wind from Tryon Lake drifted by, carrying a faint lullaby from far away. I didn't cover my ears anymore. I simply listened, to know what state the forest was in. If one day you hear someone say that the Ma Da Ranger Station still has its lights on every night, that there is still a quiet ranger there, someone who knows the rules well and always warns newcomers not to wander off, then remember this carefully. Some people don't disappear. They stay behind, so the forest never has to learn how to call a human name ever again. This is where the story ends. Once again, please remember that everything you have just heard is entirely fictional, created for storytelling and entertainment purposes only, and does not reflect real people or events. If this story was disturbing enough to make you glance at the darkness behind you, don't forget to like and subscribe to Shadows in the Night to continue following our newest horror stories. Thank you for listening, and have a good night's sleep.